Good afternoon. So, if you've read your program, it's not a mistake. My name is John C. Wattles. And I wish it were the other way. I wish Jack was here. Unfortunately, he's got a better view than everybody. So I'm the nephew of Jack. I'm the son of Tom, who is Jack's brother. And I'm honored to be here, and named after Jack. You know, Jack would have absolutely loved this. He would have loved the gathering of his many, many dear friends and his family. And he would love this as long as it's a celebration. Because he hated funerals. Absolutely hated them. So we're here to celebrate, and we're here to celebrate an incredible life. And so welcome on behalf of the family. It was a life of purity of heart, a selfless man, a family man, a businessman, a man loved by all those he touched. A life that was full of laughter, and a life of many, many lessons. Jack was a teacher. And the lessons that we have taken from him, he's going to live in our hearts forever. And that's a wonderful thing. So let's just let the celebration begin. Let me start by introducing one of his granddaughters. Liz Perry is Sarah's daughter.
Hey everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here. My grandpa loved each and every one of you dearly. I was asked to say a prayer for the service, but before I get started, I want to acknowledge that losing Jack Wattles, John C. Wattles, Poppy, Uncle Jack, and Dad is a huge loss. There is room and space to feel his absence and feel it deeply. Grief is not a process to move through to get to the other side, but a lifelong journey that points us to all of our love. Because grief is a signal of the love we had and have for someone. It is not something to avoid, but rather to press into, reminding us of how special our relationship was with the person we lost. My grandpa once said, Kalamazoo streets are like driving through the Grand Canyon, if you could drive through the Grand Canyon. Once you get to Portage, it's smooth sailing. And I think the grieving process is a little like that too. At first it's bumpy and jostles you, but as time goes on, the potholes become less pronounced and the memories become sweet. And while many of you know, my grandpa did not shy away from the pain of life. He would also want his memorial to be a time of celebrating his life. Where am I? His life. 1 second, guys. Okay, celebrating his life, the impact he made on each person sitting in this room, those who have passed on or are not here, and in classic Poppy fashion, keeping the many memories that he shared with us and that we made together alive through storytelling. Many of you know my grandpa was an amazing storyteller, and I hope that throughout our time together today and beyond, that we will be able to keep honoring Poppy's legacy by sharing stories and keeping our memories of him alive. So as we go through this day, let us be comfortable holding the tension of acknowledging the loss of the most incredible man, while at the same time honoring him by celebrating his life, legacy, and the unique impact he made on each and every person here and beyond. Let today be a time of joy, laughter, and remembering the amazing man that was the one and only Jack Wattles. Let's pray. O God of peace, who has taught us that in returning and rest we shall be saved, in quietness and in confidence shall be our strength. By the might of your Spirit, lift us, we pray, to your presence, where we may be still and know that you are God. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Now I'd like to invite my cousin Meg up. In my earliest memory of my grandfather, I think I was 5, and I was on the steps at the top of the driveway, going down to the family cottage at Lake Michigan. We must have just gotten to the lake for the 4th of July and driven in from Kalamazoo that morning. I had gotten out of the car and was about to go down the steps when I stopped, turned around, and looked up at Poppy, who was standing behind me. He bent down, fished around in his pocket, and pulled out a pack of special Trident raspberry-flavored gum, placing a stick of this delicious gum right in my palm. I call this special gum because until the age of 13, I and the rest of my New Jersey-based family believed that this flavor of gum could only be found in Michigan. Because no matter how hard we looked, we could never find the right flavor in New Jersey. And to us, because it was not only the best flavor of gum one could find, but also due to its rarity in New Jersey grocery stores, it became known to my brothers and me as the special Michigan gum. Now, Poppy knew how much we loved this one flavor, so he made sure he would always have some in his pocket when we came to town. Not only did I think it was the best tasting gum out there, but I, 5-year-old Meg, really believed that my grandfather was the only person in the world who could get that gum, which placed even more value on its possession. So that's it. That's the first memory I have of him. Very simply, the act of placing a stick of gum in my hand as we head down the steps to the cottage. There are certain places in the world that hold particularly high value and meaning to people. For me, our family cottage on Lake Michigan is one of those places. Aside from the lake's spectacular beauty and Saugatuck's charming stores and restaurants, the cottage contains 3 generations of Wattles family memories. And I know for my cousins and me, it's impossible to separate memories of our grandfather from memories at the cottage. Person and place are so intertwined that it is difficult to imagine being at the cottage without seeing Poppy sitting out on the deck in the shade, baseball cap on, sunglasses on, chin to his chest, dozing, with a newspaper in his lap. Take a look at this for reference. It's even harder to imagine the absence of his distinct laugh, which could be heard from rooms away, or to not hear one of his common conversational phrases, "Is that right?" when listening to a story. Poppy and my grandmother Helen managed to take a modest, unassuming cottage and turn it into the most cherished family gathering place I know. A few weeks ago, I asked my cousins to write down some words that came to mind when they thought of Poppy. The common descriptors were that he was humble, resilient, generous, grounded, methodical, good-humored. Through the eyes of his grandchildren, I think that this paints a fairly accurate picture of Jack Wattles, a man of extraordinary humility and great resiliency, who remained grounded throughout his life. He once said to me that one's name should only appear in the newspaper twice. Once when you marry and once when you die. Any more than that and you're probably in trouble. I think this attitude best encapsulates his Midwestern values and work ethic, a quiet diligence and desire to remain out of the spotlight, to not seek attention or praise for his achievements, to invest in his community for future generations to thrive. One trait that was nearly universal in what my cousin said about Poppy was his twinkle, this twinkle in his eye. Not only a look of wisdom and humor, but also a bit of mischief. We'd sometimes see this look if he would call us into his office to sneak us a little cash, which he did with some frequency, much to our parents' annoyance, I'm sure. To me, Poppy demonstrated deep inner strength and showed his family how to be resilient throughout life's hardships. Over the last few years, as he faced continuous health setbacks, he started saying, "Getting old isn't for sissies." And I have to be honest,
and admit that before I heard him say that, I had never really considered how physically and mentally difficult it must be to age and to slowly lose control of what you can do. Aging might have been one of the greatest challenges my grandfather ever faced, and yet, like in much of the rest of his life, he approached it with immense fortitude and good humor. My grandfather was the model for resiliency, humility, and grounding, and I was fortunate enough to observe these qualities in him for 30 years. I am so thankful for his well-lived life and the lessons he imparted consistently through his words and by his example. And now I'd like to invite up Marion's son, Rob.
Thanks, Meg. Hello, everyone. It's quite an honor to speak on behalf of our family for Jack. Our perspective from our family is a little different because, of course, Jack became our stepfather at the age of 80. My mom was 78. It doesn't happen every day. So we knew of Jack. Mom and Jack had always been friends, part of the Bonita Bay, what we used to call Camp Bonita. They all seem to be having so much fun down there. But eventually, we knew that they were together, and Angie and I started to notice Jack's name on my mom's to-do list, her calendar, and it kept popping up again and again, and we looked at each other, and Angie and I were like, yeah, something's going on. So, I asked my mom if she remembered the first time that she knew that it might be something more than the +1 situation that is so common. And she relayed a story about going to a MSU football game with Jim and Sheila Ware, and Jack came along, and she said that as the bands were, she remembered that coming out of the tunnel, the bands were coming out after the game, and my mom grabbed Jack's hand and said, Jack, let's go watch the bands. And if you know Jack, that if he makes a football game, military precision of a marching band, and my mother's loving touch, that's a pretty potent chemical. So as time went on, they got closer, and you knew that they really enjoyed each other's company. And my mom would be hosting a dinner party impromptu again, and Jack would just sit in a chair and look at her and smile and laugh and say, your mother is a wonder. And I agree. And my mom would lovingly dote on Jack, and I said at the time, to Angie, I said, I've never seen a 77, 78-year-old woman blush, but I think I just saw it. And Jack was so sweet to my mom, and I thank him for that. Finally, one day, my mom asked us, she had us all in the room, and asked us if we thought it would be okay if Jack and Marion got married. And of course, I said something stupid like, as long as I don't have to see him in his underwear on Christmas morning, I'll be, and he makes you happy, I'm good. It was clear that they were really happy together, and we got to know the Wattles family, and it was terrific. You're all terrific. And thank you for accepting my mom, although I think she's pretty great. So. Jack, my best buddy was Steve Tyler. And I get choked up every time I talk about Stevie. But he was, you know, Helen and Jack were Uncle Jack and Aunt Helen, and Stevie always talked about what a great guy he was. And he was right. He was right. So I called my brothers up and I said, hey, I gotta say something about Jack. What do you guys think? What are your impressions? What would you like me to say? And, you know, those same words keep coming up. Smart, classy. That's my favorite. I think he's a classy guy. Integrity, all those things you hope somebody would say about you. Anyway, you know, Jack was kind of a stoic, but in the best way. It wasn't, you know, his emotions were certainly there, but you could count on Jack to be a little bit of a stoic. And I remember the first time I knew that Jack was an emotional guy was when their house on Oakland Drive caught fire. And it was funny because, anyway, they brought the cat out and who had died, and Jack loved Sam, the cat. And in fact, he was buried with Sam's ashes today. And that was very touching. And, but if you wanted to see some emotion, all you had to do was mention Jack, or Sam to Jack, and it was cool. Also, anytime I had occasion to be with Jack on his birthday several times, and boy, when his grandkids would call, and I don't know if you guys planned it, he timed it so well. Everybody would call in succession, and he was on the phone all day, but he loved it, and he perked up. Anyway, he really loved you guys. So if you really wanted to see Jack's emotions, I thought about the fact that all I had to do was put on a good John Wayne movie, particularly World War II movie, a VHS tape of the Marine Corps band. I watched a few of those with Jack. Or watch Gary Sinise pay tribute to fallen veterans. You would see some emotion from Jack. In fact, Jack was truly proud of our nation's armed forces, his own military service. Thank you for that, Jack. And our country in general. Patriotism was really part of his soul, I think. Again, I'd like to thank Jack for loving my mom in the way that he did, to the Wattles family for accepting my mom. I also want to thank my brother Jim, who, you know, he did a lot for Jack, more than any of us know. So, yeah, we don't say it enough, but trust me, we're grateful. And finally, I'd like to thank Jack for some of the things he taught me. Other than that, he was encyclopedic knowledge of this community, and I'm really going to miss that. But he taught me a few things. One was you should never fact check anyone on Google while they're in the middle of telling their story. I did that once. Just once. And then it is far better to follow directions while you're driving when those directions are coming from the back seat. Follow them precisely. Just a good thing to remember. And when you're watching a football game and screaming at the top of your lungs, "Get him!" To the point it started with, that's not advice, that's a virtue. And I appreciate
checking out the room. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charlie's wife, Rose, and I first met Jack Wattles in the mid-1980s. And in the years that followed, I made my way to becoming his favorite daughter-in-law. So I have been asked to speak on behalf of Katie, Charlie, and Marion, and and look to them for things they might want me to say. And the idea was that I might be able to convey their words without becoming overly emotional. So I will try not to open the infamous Wattles faucets, which would tend to flow with any sad situation, a family goodbye, or even an awe-inspiring movie. Believe me, I have watched Seabiscuit with these people. To be fair, this family of mine has seen a good deal of loss, and they've had many reasons to cry. This newly added loss of our dad, Poppy, or Jack, is a monumental change for us, as he was a monumental person. His much sought after wisdom and advice rippled through all the layers of his life, like the waves he would watch from his deck over the coast of Lake Michigan. Jack was born in South Bend, Indiana, where his father, Charles Pierre Wattles, was a lawyer, a teacher of law at Notre Dame, and a real estate developer. And his mother, Carmen, was an accomplished pianist. During World War II, Carmen played for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, a role not made available to women outside of wartime. He had one brother, Tom, who was 8 years older, just older enough to be deeply revered and emulated by Jack. Charles and Carmen were prominent in South Bend, and there are many stories of the great people they had entertained, like Newt Rockne and Cardinal Pacelli, soon to be Pope Pius XII. Jack's upbringing can be described as formal. When I asked Charlie to say a little more about this, he reminded me that Charles Pierre would mow his lawn in a white shirt and tie. Or, as Katie added, Jack grew up in a household where children were meant to be neither seen nor heard. So today I want to also mention the fondness that Jack shared with us for his Uncle Bob and Aunt Jan. They were relatives on his mother's side, and Jack described them as all heart. Jack felt at home in their house in Oxford, Indiana. And Uncle Bob, who was a banker, took an active interest in young Jack, which was likely the seed for the career choice he made later of banking and finance. Jack did not dine at the family table with his mother and father unless in a jacket and tie. And so he often recounted the numerous times he would take his dinner with the help in the kitchen. Here, among these people who ran the house, he found tremendous kindness. It was likely the beginning of his observing how things work behind the scenes, the maintenance that a home requires. It is safe to say that Jack had always relied on skilled people to help him run his homes. He spoke highly of them. He recognized their good work, and he always treated them with generosity. The family now has an expression for getting one's home in tip-top shape. It's called Jackified. At age 10, Jack became a student at Howe Military School in Howe, Indiana, which was a boarding school for boys. He remained a student at Howe until he graduated high school as a high school senior. Cadet life laid the template for his education. It was formal, structured, rigorous, Just as much as home life, these teachers, officers, and chaplains helped to shape the man he would become. Traveling occasionally together to the east to visit the barns or attend a graduation, it was not uncommon to spot a few military students in the airport. Jack always pointed them out to us, usually knowing which school or which brand of service. He was emotionally stirred in these moments, but it was not a wave of patriotism. It wasn't that grand. It was more personal, like he recognized a kindredship when he saw these students, and he wanted us all to know that as well. Jack met Helen Stotler Fisher at Western Michigan University in his college years on a blind date. They married in Stetson Chapel on the campus of K College. And from my own years of knowing them, I know they were a fun couple from the get-go. Active in golf, bridge, and tennis, throwing potluck parties, and regularly attending the Civic Theater. And they took their summers on the beach in Lake Michigan, which opened up another enduring social group for them. Helen had deep roots in Kalamazoo, and Jack embraced her families, the Fishers and the Stotlers, as his own. Together, Helen and Jack raised 3 dynamic, educated, talented, and I like to say good-looking children. And they came to know and love a bevy of wonderful grandchildren. As you've heard, he was an awesome grandfather. It was when I saw him laugh and smile the most whenever his grandkids were nearby. He knew and celebrated each and every one of their unique talents with genuine pride, which is a gift. And speaking of gifts, Jack had a habit of keeping a bit of cash in his pocket and always told his grandkids to never be without a $50 bill in your wallet. He would emphasize this by reaching out a gently closed fist whenever one of them was leaving or going off to school or heading east. And in his fist was the aforementioned cash, which the kids always took just as much for him as for themselves. Not long ago, we were having lunch on the deck in Saugatuck while Midge and Luca were in town. Luca rounded the table as lunch was ending to say goodbye to Poppy. Out came the fist from his pocket. And he encouraged Luca to take what was there in his hand. And Luca looked back at Poppy incredulous and said, "What is this? I am not the waiter." And Poppy roared with laughter. It tickled him. So, Jack loved the city of Kalamazoo, and he was right at home with its exceptional level of charitable giving, which has created the foundation for its impressive culture. He was involved in nonprofit governance at Lakeside, Pretty Lake, the Civic Theater, the YMCA. At the YMCA alone, he was in governance for 40 years and attached to the organization for over 60 years. Though Charlie tells me some of that was to get a little exercise and a massage. I've never seen any fanfare directed toward Jack for this generosity. It was understood he was committed to the service of others and to setting that example. He was well respected in Kalamazoo professional circles. During his investment years, he had many devoted customers. These were caring, long, multi-generational relationships, as Jack often went above and beyond to help the people he worked for regarding whatever life was bringing their way. One could always count on him to make decisions wisely. As Marty Reams simply put it, he was smart. I consider myself among the many who have benefited from those smarts. I've heard people refer to him as their compass or their guiding light. And oh, how we will miss that light. I'm now going to just give a brief inventory of the Poppy I knew, beyond the family man, businessman, community man. He loved toys. He had a penchant for stuffed animals, which he would buy in quantity, and always seemed to have one left over for himself. And how many of you still have your orange orangutans? Because I think Jack probably still has his. He loved gadgets, had the latest cameras, DVD players, radios. I recall a birthday when he gave Helen one of the very first models of the cell phone. It was white and big as a large shoe. And she was a bit bewildered by it. I remember she was like, a portable phone? Why on earth would a person need that? She might have been right about that, but anyway. Jack loved fishing. Charlie said that a carbon fiber fly rod fit perfectly in his hands. He loved horses. He was raised around horses. He was thrilled when he could watch his granddaughter Liz ride. And I know his niece Jane will miss their many conversations about the horse races. He always wore V-neck cashmere sweaters, which made his hugs a little more plush. He endowed us with his mother's coveted peanut brittle recipe, the original copy calling for butter the size of a walnut. He liked his Diet Coke with lime, his toast burnt, and his vegetables soft. Whenever he ordered a steak, he would say, "Ruin it." He dutifully delivered wreaths to family gravestones on the holidays. He loved hokey musicals like Hello Dolly, South Pacific, and many times took the whole lot of us to Broadway for a show. He loved football and college marching bands, which leads me to Marion and that Spartan game when she took his hand. Shortly after that, word spread that Jack seemed to have regained the spring in his step. And then there was the one night Jack and Marion stayed out late together after a play at the Civic, leaving his granddaughter Katie, who was living with him at the time, to wonder, what on earth was he up to? The play was over long ago. Of course, she waited up for him to get his explanation. And the explanation was that he had found someone to fill his heart again. Marion, we mean it when we say that you kept him going, and you gave us many wonderful years with him that I'm not sure we would have had without you. So we love you for that. Yeah. And then, in closing, I just want to say something to Charlie and Katie, to thank them for letting me do this, talk about your dad in this manner. And just to say that you were his pillars, especially once Sarah had passed away. The two of you were always there for him at his side. And I think you'll still be the pillars we need in the family. I think you have all of that from him and from yourselves. And I'm just really grateful to have done this. It's for you.
So I'm honored to be speaking today. Again, I was actually told I was going to be speaking. It was over a year ago, and Charlie cornered me and said he and his dad were thinking about the memorial and said they've selected you to speak. And I'm honored by that, very much so. But I accepted with a little trepidation. And the trepidation was not necessarily speaking in front of people, but getting it wrong. You know, having it be sad. You know, not being a celebration. Because I knew Jack. And if I didn't get it right, when we meet up again, I'm going to hear about it. So in our family, Jack was the family historian. You know, I swear he had a photographic memory. I mean, I heard encyclopedic memory for the community, but also for the family history. I mean, he could identify a name, a place of origin, a story to go with it, and it was just amazing. I often asked him, you need to write this down. And unfortunately, I don't think he ever did. But in that vein, I'm going to give you a little bit of the Wattles family history with a Jack Wattles slant to it. So the very first Wattles came to this country in 1651. And he arrived on the board of a ship called the John and Sarah. Interesting family names. And he came with 300 other men, and they were slaves, all of them. And including, as they docked in Boston, one of those slaves got off, and his name was Captain John Wattles. And he was actually a prisoner of war of the English. He was captured as he was fighting alongside Oliver Cromwell. And of course, he was doing right. John Wattles was doing right. He was fighting for freedom. And he was captured by the English, and like many others of the unwanted in the English Empire, they shipped him off to Australia or to America. And fortunately, Captain John Wattles, or Mick Wattles as he was known in Scotland, you know, came to America. And you know, he brought with him many Scottish traits. Now, like many Western Europeans, we were of Scottish ancestry, but we were mutts, right? We had a little Dutch in us, a little French, a little English, but primarily Scottish. And as I prepared for this today, I thought, you know, what are the character traits of the Scottish people? So you heard a few of these traits and attributes of Jack today, but I want to read some that I found. And I think they'll really ring true to Jack Wattles. Kind, fair, honest, reliable, compassionate, determined, resilient, curious, excited by the new and the unfamiliar, and always learning and always wanting to share, thrifty, friendly, happy. I pause there because can't you hear his laugh right now? Protective, proud, opinionated, frank, competitive, humble, modest, to the point of being uncomfortable with praise, and ethically led. And there was a great quote, and I'll share the quote. Our moral compass is the driver of our decisions, and this is talking about Scots. Our moral compass is the driver of our decisions, and big-heartedness is something we do well. Doesn't that sound like Jack Wattles? So as Rose said, he grew up in South Bend in a very formal household. They had horses. He had a horse named Tango. And his love of horses, and the family's love of horses, likely came from his grandfather, whom he was named after, John C. Wattles I. So he was John C. Wattles I, Jack was the second, and I'm John C. Wattles III. And his grandfather was known for training a legendary horse by the name of Dan Patch. And Dan Patch, you know, was famous worldwide because he was the very first horse to break 2 minutes for the mile, with a time of 1 minute and 55 seconds. He actually went on and broke that record again. He got to the point where other horses would not run against him. He would run against the clock. They would put 50 to 70,000 people in the stadium to watch this horse run against the clock to see if he could do the record. And Jack loved that story, but the real story was of Jack's grandfather. You know, and it was the character traits of his grandfather that I think were carried down to Jack. Because if it wasn't for John C. Wattles I, you never would have heard of Dan Pash. The horse was born a cripple. His back legs were almost backwards. And the owner of the horse and the trainer, John Wattles, were advised to euthanize the horse. And they wouldn't have anything of it. So Jack's grandfather every day would get up many times and help that horse up so it could nurse to its mother. And night after night, day after day, you know, and slowly that horse got strong. He put him behind a sulky because that motion of the legs going back and forth was strengthened, and eventually that horse got very fast, very fast. But it was those character traits of hard work, determination, resilience, you know, that made that horse who it was. And isn't that Jack Wattles? So as we heard today, that Jack was raised in a very formal household, ties to mow the grass, not being able to eat at the dining room table unless they had a coat and tie. So Jack was relegated to the kitchen. He was comfortable there, loved it. So today I'm wearing Jack Wattles' formal wear. Sport coat, polo shirt, khakis, and always comfortable shoes. There was another story that Rose had said about Cardinal Pacelli, who went on to become Pope Pius XII. And, you know, their house in South Bend was a place of dignitaries with me. And the Father O'Hara, the president of Notre Dame University, asked the Wattles if they would host Father Cardinal Pacelli for a dinner. So, and they graciously agreed. And of course, Jack was relegated to the kitchen, where he was comfortable. He was with his staff, he was eating, but he was a curious little guy. And he would peek through that door every chance he could get. And it was one of those doors that was on a pivot, and every now and then the door would stick, and he could look through and see what was going on. And they were Protestants, right? I mean, this collars and stuff, and especially, again, a robe, was very strange, especially to a 6 or 7 year old. And at one point, the cardinal, you know, recognized there was a little boy looking through that doorway. And their eyes locked. And it was a very powerful moment for Jack Wattles, you know, because that cardinal went on to become Pope Pius XII. And maybe it was more than an eye lock. Maybe it was a blessing. Because Jack lived a blessed life. You know, another thing that came out of South Bend, where Jack was born, was his love for fishing. You know, for whatever reason, at the turn of the century in the 1900s, South Bend, Indiana was the fishing mecca of the world. Whether it was fishing poles, fishing reels, fishing lines, fishing lures, they were all manufactured in South Bend, Indiana. And Jack's father was an attorney, and he often represented those clients. And his compensation came in the form of equipment and trips. So they had a lot of fishing equipment, and they took a lot of fishing trips. And one spot that they absolutely loved to go to was a place called the French River. It was about 7 hours north of Toronto. They went as a family. I mean, Jack would go with his brother, with his father, with his mother, and many, many, many friends. And this tradition carried on for years. And the French River is a gorgeous area. It's wilderness. It's sloping granite rocks with black, cold, clear water that nestled in between. And the fishing was incredible. I mean, the stories in the family, and Charlie and Kate, you probably heard them, you know, they had to quit fishing by the time it was noon, because their arms were so tired from reeling the fish. And I saw the pictures. I mean, it may have been true. But this was a trip that he loved and returned to and thought about many, many, many times, even in his later life. You know, he'd often think about you know, going back to the French River. But as he was growing up, when Kate and Helen and Charlie and Jack lived on Pinehurst, you know, he would get ready for those trips. He would tell Helen he's going out to mow the yard. And they had a big backyard. And he would go out and mow the yard. He wouldn't wear a coat and tie like his father. But he would mow the yard, but there was an ulterior motive, and that was to practice his casting. So once he got done, he would take his spinning rod out and his fly rod. The Wattles family were early adopters of fly fishing. And he would take a plastic cup, and he would put that cup in the middle of that mowed yard, and whether it was 20, 30, or 40 feet, he would cast that fly rod. And I don't know if you've ever cast a fly rod, but it is not the easiest thing to do. Again, the character traits: determination, hard work, resilience, fun. Jack was very good at casting a fly rod. He could land the end of that line in the middle of that cup time after time after time again. And all the time, Helen thought he was mowing the yard. I think it's real love for the fishing. Not only was the camaraderie, the fishing was great at the Chaudière at the French River, but was the shore lunches. The shore lunches were absolutely incredible. Now, if you think about it, they would go out fishing for walleye in the morning, and then at a meeting point, all the boats would gather on these sloping granite rocks. The guides would get out, and they'd fillet up these fish. They'd coat them in flour and cornmeal and cut up some onions and French fries and beans, and the guides would cook them over this open fire. And there was one time that I went out with Jack one morning, and we were fishing for walleye, and it's pretty boring fishing. You drop your line all the way to the bottom, reel it up about 6 inches, and you wait for the fish to hit. And it's just a very slight take. And Jack, being a banker, I mean, he knew how to count. You know, I was fishing on my side, and within 15 minutes, I had 4 or 5 fish. He didn't have anything. So he's looking at me, and he says, "You mind if we switch sides?" Sure. Flip over, switch sides. Again, right after, one after another, I was catching these walleye. And he's watching this, and after we have about 8 fish in the boat, he turns to the guide and says, "I think we have enough for lunch. Let's get out of here." So we headed to the rocks. We met up with these guides. They had this incredible meal, And Jack absolutely loved that. He dreamed of those meals. It was a gourmet meal for an outdoorsman. And there was one time that he loved this story, where he was about to get back in the boat. It was the waters were kind of choppy that day. And his guide, Indian from the local reservation, was a gentleman by the name of Frank Doucette. And he was sitting in the back of the boat. And Jack was the guy who was pushing that boat off into the water from the rocks. And just as he went to push off, a wave hit the back of the boat, slammed the gunnel up against his shin, and boom, and it hurt. And without missing a beat, Frank Doucette, the guy, looks at him and goes, "One of God's mistakes." And Jack looks at him, he said, "Put the meat on the wrong side of the shin." I think I heard that story 100 times from Jack. So as Rose said, you know, Jack had a very disciplined elementary school, high school, Hell military school. And he also had a very formal in his family. I mean, very strict. So when it got time to go to college, he enrolled, like his father and his brother, at the University of Michigan. Well, for the first time, Jack had some freedom. And, you know, perhaps it was a blessing. And probably a little too much enjoyment of college life. But his life was redirected to Western Michigan University. And that was a blessing. And it was a blessing for 2 reasons. One, he met and fell in love with his first love of his life, Helen Fisher. And his second blessing was he fell in love with the city and community of Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he absolutely loved this area. And it wasn't the city itself. It was you. It was the people. That's what he fell in love with. And you know Jack, when he loved something, he took ownership. He was a giver, especially to the community. And this is a great story from Charlie, and give you the attribution of it. But you know, when you head to the library or bookstore, there are aisles and aisles and rows of books on self-help. If you were to look into the heart of Jack Wattles, there was not one single book entitled Self-Help. But there were volumes and volumes of books called Help Others. And that's who he was. You know, whether it was his clients or the community, the Civic Theater, the YMCA, the Sherman Lakes YMCA, the Family and Children's Services, he was involved. He was a persistent donor. And not only involved with his money, but involved with his time. And what he especially loved was helping kids attend camp. And he worked with the Sherman Lakes and the Family and Children's Services for that. Because he had this belief that you put kids in an outdoor setting at night with other campers, no electricity, and magic happens. You know, it gives them a foundation that they can take on for the rest of their life. It points them in the right direction. You know, whether that's confidence, whether that's leadership, whatever it is, that was a positive path. And, you know, Jack firmly believed in that, and in swimming. I mean, he absolutely believed everybody should learn to swim. I mean, Kate, Charlie, you didn't even have a choice whether you were going to camp, right? You went, you learned to swim. Charlie got thrown in whether he wanted it or not, and sink or swim. That was the way he worked. And Jack attended many camps himself from an early age, where he and I kind of had a bond. Was a camp called Camp Chicopee. And it helped shape him. It was an all-sports camp. It had a strong focus on swimming. It was started by a gentleman by the name of Matt Mann. Matt was the University of Michigan swim coach. And he was also a 7-time U.S. Olympic coach. So there were a lot of great swimmers that passed through this camp. And everybody learned to swim. In fact, there was one tenet of the camp, and that was that you had to swim a timed open water mile. And once you were finished, your name and your time was posted on the camp wall. And if you were to walk into that main house of that camp today where everybody ate, there would be posters going back from 1928 to today with every camper.